Welcome to the deep dive. You sent us a really fascinating research paper this week titled Children's Difficulties in Reading Comprehension by Jane Oakhill.
Mm-hmm.
And what really grabbed me, and what we're going to unpack right now, is that head-scratching situation where a child can read words perfectly well, they sound fluent, but when you ask them what it was all about,
Yeah.
it's like they hadn't understood a thing.
Right.
We're diving into that gap between simply reading the words and actually understanding them, something that often becomes noticeable around age 8.
Exactly. And this paper really gets to the heart of why this happens. It looks at why some kids can decode words effortlessly but totally miss the meaning, while others seem to grasp the essence of what they're reading much better, even if they stumble on a few words.
Yeah.
Our mission in this deep dive is to extract the core theoretical explanations the paper offers for this comprehension deficit.
Okay, so the paper lays out three main ways researchers have looked at this. First, whether the issue stems from difficulties with single words themselves. Second, problems with how children analyze sentences, the grammar and meaning of the words together. We can think of grammar as syntax, the structure of sentences, and meaning as semantics.
Got it. Syntax and semantics.
But the third area, and it sounds like the one Oakhill focuses on most, is about higher level comprehension skills. Things like making inferences, connecting ideas, and even knowing when you don't understand something.
Ah, the metacognitive stuff, too.
Exactly. We're going to explore all three of these angles to give you a much clearer understanding.
Let's start with that first idea. Do difficulties with single words hold back comprehension, even in kids who seem to read them well? There's this bottleneck idea,
Hmm.
suggesting that if decoding words isn't automatic and takes a lot of mental effort, it uses up valuable short-term memory, the kind you need to hold on to and understand what those words mean together.
That makes sense intuitively, right? If you're really struggling to pronounce each word, you probably don't have much brain power left to think about the overall message.
You'd think so.
But the paper presents some pretty compelling evidence that this isn't the primary reason why good decoders struggle to comprehend. So, focusing solely on making kids read faster might not necessarily make them understand better, a crucial point for educators.
Absolutely. What's fascinating is the evidence against that simple bottleneck idea,
Mm-hmm.
especially for the kids who are interested in those who are good at decoding.
Right.
The paper mentions Cromer's work way back in 1970, which looked at college students with different comprehension abilities but similar IQs, vocabularies, and even how fast they could read.
Wow. College students, even.
Yeah, that right away suggests that speed reading words doesn't automatically equal good comprehension.
And it gets even more specific with Oakhill's own research with younger kids. Studies in the 80s and early 90s consistently showed that there weren't significant differences in how quickly or automatically these good and poor comprehenders could read single words.
Mm.
So the kids who were struggling to understand weren't necessarily slower at saying the words themselves.
Exactly. And if slow decoding was the main problem, you'd expect that if you trained a child to decode faster, their comprehension would improve.
Logically, yeah.
But as the paper points out, several studies by researchers like Perfetti and Hogeboom, Fleischer, Jenkins, and Pani, and even Ewell and Oakhill, found that while you could improve how quickly they read words, it didn't usually lead to them understanding better.
Huh.
There was one exception mentioned, Mazinski's 1983 study, but overall, the link just wasn't strong.
Even when they use texts made up of the very words the kids had been trained on, that really drives home the point that being able to read the words quickly is likely something you need, but it's definitely not enough on its own to make you a good comprehender.
Right.
It's like knowing all the individual ingredients in a recipe, but having no idea how to combine them to make the final dish.
Exactly. It seems rapid decoding might pave the way for comprehension to develop more easily over time, but it doesn't directly cause good comprehension in the moment. The paper emphasizes that specific comprehension skills themselves need to be in place. And this leads us to the second theoretical approach. Do difficulties with understanding sentence structure and word meanings, together, what we called syntax and semantics, play a key role?
Okay, so this is about understanding how words work together in sentences, the structure, the meaning they create together.
Mm-hmm.
And the paper brings back Cromer here, specifically his difference group. These were the poor comprehenders who, just like the kids Oakhill studied, had good vocabulary and decoding skills.
What's really interesting here is Cromer's experiment, where he showed texts in different ways, as complete sentences broken down into meaningful groups of words, as fragmented illogical groups, and then just as single words.
Okay, quite a few conditions.
Yeah. What he discovered was that when the sentences were broken into meaningful chunks, the difference group actually understood better.
Ah.
This suggested that they were typically reading word by word and weren't effectively using the sentence structure, the syntax, to help them grasp the meaning.
So, for them, the normal flow of a sentence was almost a barrier, and they needed those logical breaks to make sense of it.
It seems so.
Whereas good comprehenders, the study also showed, were actually more confused by the broken up phrases and single words, implying they do rely on that sentence structure to build meaning.
Precisely. It points to a different way of processing text.
Mhm.
Now, while this suggests that understanding sentence structure does play a role, Oak Hill and her colleagues also dug deeper. Their work, particularly in Oak Hill and Garnham's 1988 review and Yule and Oak Hill's 1991 book, really zoomed in on those higher-level skills we mentioned earlier.
Right.
Inference, putting ideas together, and knowing when you're not understanding.
Right, the integration and monitoring. And to really figure out if there were fundamental problems with understanding grammar itself, they even used a specific test, Bishop's test for reception of grammar, or TROG.
The TROG. And the key thing to note here is that when they gave the TROG, they didn't find any significant overall differences between the good and poor comprehenders in their understanding of a wide variety of grammatical constructions.
Okay, so it wasn't the basic grammar rules tripping them up?
It seems not. This suggests that the core issue for these poor comprehenders wasn't necessarily a lack of basic grammatical knowledge.
Which brings us to the third theoretical approach, and the one that seems to be the main focus of Oak Hill's own extensive research. Deficits in those higher-order comprehension skills, the ability to infer information and integrate ideas within a text.
Yes, this is where the paper really gets into the details of the differences between these two groups of children. Oak Hill and her team designed some very clever experiments, often comparing carefully matched groups of 7 to 8-year-olds.
Matched groups, okay.
These groups were similar in their ability to accurately read words aloud and in their understanding of individual word meanings, but they differed significantly in how well they understood short texts, as measured by the Neal analysis of reading ability.
Okay, so decoding and vocab were similar, but comprehension was the key difference.
Exactly.
And one of the first big questions they tackled was how memory plays into comprehension. Because, as the paper points out, many comprehension tests also rely on your memory. You read something, and then you have to remember it to answer questions.
Right, it's a confound.
So, how do you figure out if a child is struggling with understanding or just with remembering what they read?
That's a really crucial distinction. So in a very smart study in 1984, Oak Hill had children read passages aloud and then answer questions in two ways. First, just from what they remembered,
Okay.
and then again with the text right in front of them. They also looked at whether the questions asked for facts that were directly stated or required them to infer something.
And what did they find? Because that setup sounds like a great way to separate memory from comprehension. The crucial insight here, for us listening to this, is that if a child struggles to answer questions even with the text in front of them, it's a red flag for a deeper comprehension issue, not just a bad memory.
The results were quite revealing. As you might expect, both groups did better when they could see the text, and questions that asked for specific facts were easier for everyone.
Makes sense.
But here's where it gets really interesting. While both groups improved with the text for those factual questions, the less skilled comprehenders still had trouble with the questions that required them to infer something, even when the text was right there.
Wow. Even with the text.
Yeah. They made significantly more errors, around 35% compared to just under 10% for the skilled group. So the key takeaway for understanding these struggling readers is that if they can't answer questions even with the text present, it points to a real comprehension problem, not just a memory issue.
Wow. So it wasn't simply that they had forgotten what they read. They had the information right in front of them, but they still couldn't put the pieces together or figure out what wasn't explicitly stated.
Exactly. This strongly suggested a real problem with understanding, not just with memory. The paper even considers the idea that maybe these kids didn't have the background knowledge needed to make the inferences. But it argues that the inferences they tested were pretty basic and not likely to depend on specialized knowledge.
Okay.
Instead, the problem might have been in realizing that an inference was needed in the first place, or perhaps in their brain's ability to process information, which made it hard for them to connect what they were reading with what they already knew.
That makes sense. It's like having all the ingredients but not realizing you need to combine them in a specific way to get the final dish.
Good analogy.
And they followed this up with another fascinating line of research, looking at inferences that didn't even depend on general knowledge, right?
Yes. In these studies, done in the early to mid-80s, children listened to very short three-sentence stories and then took a test to see if they recognized certain sentences.
Okay.
The test included sentences that were actually in the story, valid inferences that logically followed from the story, and invalid inferences that didn't make sense.
And the idea here was to see if good comprehenders were better at grasping the overall meaning, even if they didn't remember the exact words.
Precisely. And that's what they found. Good comprehenders were more likely to mistakenly say they had heard the valid inferences,
Ah, interesting.
suggesting they were building a more connected understanding of the meaning, rather than just remembering the words exactly.
So they were getting the gist better.
Exactly. Interestingly, this happened even when they just listened to the stories, which, as the paper points out, means this isn't just a problem specific to reading. It's about how they process and connect information in general.
So it's a more fundamental thinking process at play. And then they explored another aspect of inference called instantiation. Can you explain what that is?
Sure. Instantiation is the idea that when we read a general word in a specific situation, we tend to give it a more specific meaning in our minds. The paper gives a classic example. The fish attacked the swimmer.
Right.
In that situation, we're more likely to picture a shark or some other dangerous type of fish, even though the word fish itself is very broad.
Right. The context gives our brain clues to narrow down the meaning. And Oak Hill investigated whether good and poor comprehenders differed in this ability.
They did. And they found that good comprehenders were significantly more likely to make these kinds of specific interpretations, these instantiations, than poor comprehenders. This suggests that the less skilled comprehenders might be sticking to a more literal, less detailed understanding of the words in the text.
It's like they're seeing a blurry image where others are seeing a sharp one because they're not using the surrounding details to bring it into focus.
That's a good way to put it.
And this ability to connect ideas also comes into play with understanding cohesive ties in a text, like pronouns. These are words like he or she that refer back to someone mentioned earlier.
Absolutely. These connections between different parts of the text, often through things called anaphoric links, like pronouns referring back to earlier nouns, are crucial for building a connected understanding.
Yeah, you'd get lost otherwise.
Totally. Oak Hill and Yule's 1986 study showed that poor comprehenders really struggled with pronouns, even when it was completely clear who or what the pronoun was referring to.
That must make reading feel very disconnected if you're constantly unsure who he or she is.
Exactly. And in a follow-up study using a more natural short story, they looked at a wider range of these cohesive ties. Things like ellipsis, where words are left out but implied, substitution, where one word replaces another, and lexical ties, which are connections through related words,
Okay.
based on categories developed by Halliday and Hassan. They asked children what underlined parts of the text pointed back to or asked direct questions about them.
And again, the differences between the groups were significant across the board.
Yes, very significant. Even when directly asked questions with the text available, the less skilled comprehenders were only about 72% correct, compared to 90% for the good comprehenders.
Wow, only 72% with the text right there.
Yeah. This really highlights a basic difficulty in building a coherent picture of the text, even at a relatively simple level of connecting pronouns and other referring expressions.
So we're seeing a clear pattern here. It's not primarily about decoding the individual words, and it's likely not a fundamental issue with basic grammar. The core seems to be in these higher level skills, making inferences, integrating information across sentences, and understanding how different parts of the text relate to each other through these cohesive ties.
Right.
But the paper then explores why these difficulties might arise, looking at the role of working memory.
That's right. While the studies we've discussed so far show what the difficulties are, they don't fully explain the underlying cognitive reasons. This is where the idea of working memory becomes important.
Okay.
As the paper explains, working memory is like a mental workspace with limited capacity that allows us to temporarily hold and manipulate information.
Think of it like the RAM in your computer. You can only have so many programs running smoothly at the same time. And research by Daneman and Carpenter with adults showed a clear link between how much information their working memory could handle, measured by something called a reading span test, and their comprehension skills.
Precisely. And Oak Hill adapted this idea for children. They created a similar task using numbers, where children had to read lists of numbers aloud, that's the processing part, and remember the last digit of each number group. That's the storage part.
Ah, a dual task kind of thing.
Yes, they made it harder by increasing the number of digits to remember.
And did they find a difference between the good and poor comprehenders on this number-based working memory task?
Interestingly, there was no difference on the easiest version, where they only had to remember 2 digits.
Okay.
However, the less skilled comprehenders performed significantly worse on the more challenging 3- and 4-digit versions.
Right.
This suggested that they did have a lower capacity in their working memory, at least when it came to holding and manipulating this kind of information.
Right.
And this finding was confirmed in other studies.
So it seems like for these kids, when the mental juggling gets a bit more complex, their mental workspace gets overloaded more easily, which could make it harder for them to hold on to and connect ideas as they read.
That's a strong possibility. And a further experiment by Ewell, Oak Hill, and Parkin in 1989 provided even more compelling evidence. They used short stories that had something a little odd in them, an anomaly.
Okay.
And then later in the story, they provided information that explained the oddity. They varied how far apart in the text these two pieces of information were.
So you'd read something that didn't quite make sense, and then you'd have to keep that in mind until you read further and found the piece that cleared it up.
Exactly. And they found that when the odd event and the explanation were right next to each other, both groups performed about the same in understanding why the character in the story did what they did.
Okay, no difference when it was easy.
But when those two pieces of information were separated by just 2 sentences, the understanding of the good comprehenders stayed the same, while the poor comprehenders' understanding dropped significantly.
That's a big difference from just 2 sentences apart.
Yeah, it dropped to about 17% correct for the poor comprehenders in that condition. It really shows how that gap, where they had to hold on to the initial confusing information while continuing to read to find the answer, was much harder for the less skilled group.
Absolutely.
It does. And while both groups found it slightly harder when the explanation came after the odd event, the difference wasn't statistically significant. The main point here was that the poor comprehenders struggled specifically when connecting ideas was made harder by the need to hold information in their working memory.
Right.
It wasn't that they remembered the words less well, it was the act of holding on to and connecting those ideas across a short span that seemed to be the challenge.
So the paper suggests that these less skilled comprehenders aren't necessarily forgetting the words, but they're struggling to keep the relevant pieces in their mental workspace long enough to connect them and build a coherent understanding.
Seems like it.
But then the paper moves into a really encouraging area. What can be done to help? The idea that these comprehension skills can be taught.
Yes, the training studies provide really important insights. The thinking was simple. If these children are lacking specific skills like making inferences and connecting ideas, then directly training them in those skills should lead to them understanding better.
Makes sense.
And ideally, this training would help the less skilled comprehenders more than those who are already good at it.
And the first training study they describe, by Ewell and Oak Hill in 1988, involved 3 groups of both skilled and less skilled comprehenders, right? One group received training that specifically focused on inferential skills. What exactly did that training involve?
The training was designed to actively involve the children in the process of understanding. It encouraged them to make predictions about what might happen next, to think about how different parts of the story were connected, and to check their own understanding as they read.
So very active reading strategies?
Exactly. It included direct teaching about how to make inferences and used a macro-close task where sentences were removed from stories and the children had to fill in the missing information, which often required them to make inferences. They were also encouraged to ask questions about what they were reading.
And the other groups were control groups. What kind of training did they receive?
Exactly. One control group received training focused on reading words faster to specifically test that initial bottleneck theory we talked about.
Ah.
The other control group did standard comprehension exercises, reading passages, and answering questions about them. All 3 groups had 7 30-minute sessions over a few weeks using the same types of stories.
Okay. And what were the results? Did the inference training actually make a difference?
It did. The less skilled comprehenders who received the inference training showed greater improvement in their comprehension, as measured by a different version of the Neal test compared to the skilled comprehenders.
Okay, good.
Furthermore, this inference training helped the less skilled group more than the decoding speed training did.
Yeah, that's key.
Although the improvement wasn't significantly larger than what was seen in the group that just did the standard comprehension exercises.
That's still really encouraging, though, suggesting that specifically targeting those inferential skills can be beneficial for those who are struggling. And the paper also mentions another study that used visual imagery training.
Yes, the 1991 study by Oak Hill and Patel found that training children to create mental pictures in their minds as they read also improved comprehension in the less skilled group, but didn't have the same effect on the skilled comprehenders.
Interesting. So multiple approaches seem to work for the less skilled group.
It seems so.
So these training studies really highlight the fact that the difficulties these less skilled comprehenders face are often rooted in specific thinking skills that can be developed. It's not just a fixed limitation.
Exactly.
And while working memory might play a role, directly training those comprehension skills seems to be an effective way to improve understanding, possibly by giving them strategies to work around any limitations in their working memory.
That's a really key takeaway. The paper concludes from these studies that the main issue isn't simply about having a smaller mental workspace. The training likely provided strategies that help the children process the information more effectively, even if the underlying capacity of their working memory didn't actually increase.
This has really significant implications for how we teach reading, doesn't it?
Huge.
If we can identify these children who can read the words well but aren't really understanding, we can potentially use targeted approaches to help them.
Absolutely. The paper emphasizes how important it is to recognize these silent, struggling readers.
Yeah,
Children who might seem to be doing fine because they read fluently but lack real understanding.
right.
It stresses the need to assess comprehension skills alongside the ability to recognize words right from the start.
And when it comes to actually improving comprehension in the classroom, the paper mentions that various methods exist and highlights that even relatively short periods of focused training can lead to noticeable improvements, as their research showed. But they also offer a couple of important things to keep in mind.
Yes, the paper offers two key cautions. First, it points out that we can't just assume that poor comprehenders will automatically benefit from being taught the same strategies that good readers use naturally. The fact that they haven't picked up these skills on their own might mean they need more explicit or different types of instruction.
So a one-size-fits-all approach to teaching comprehension might not be the most effective. And the second thing to be careful about is when we introduce these comprehension strategies.
Exactly. The paper suggests that introducing complex strategies for checking your understanding might actually be counterproductive for children who are still working hard to just read the words.
Overloading them.
Right. Their mental energy might be so focused on decoding that they don't have enough resources left to also think about whether they're understanding. The recommendation is to wait until their word reading skills are reasonably solid before introducing these more deliberate comprehension strategies. However, it's also vital to establish from the very beginning that the main purpose of reading is to understand.
That makes perfect sense. Build the foundation first. You need to have a good handle on reading the words before you can really focus on understanding them. Finally, the paper looks ahead, outlining some important areas for future research.
Yes, there are still many questions to be answered. One key area is to further investigate the role of working memory in children's reading comprehension. The paper suggests looking at a wider range of working memory tests, not just verbal ones, but also those involving numbers and spatial information, and seeing how performance on these relates to different aspects of comprehension ability.
It would be really interesting to know if limitations in working memory are more strongly connected to certain comprehension difficulties, like making inferences or understanding pronouns compared to others.
Precisely. The paper suggests that working memory might be especially important for comprehension tasks that require holding onto and processing information at the same time, like figuring out what a pronoun refers to or checking your understanding as you read.
Right, the integration tasks.
And less so for tasks that are more about simply remembering specific facts. The other main area for future research is to refine and expand the techniques we use to train comprehension.
So looking at how long the benefits of current training methods last, figuring out what types of training work best for different age groups, and even seeing if we should be tailoring our teaching to the specific needs of different types of poor comprehenders.
Exactly. The research so far gives us a lot of hope, but there's still a lot we can learn about how to best support children who struggle with reading comprehension, even though they can read the words well.
Well, this has been a truly eye-opening deep dive into Jane Oak Hill's research. It's really highlighted how complex reading comprehension is and moved us beyond just thinking about how well a child can decode words. For me, the key takeaways are the clear difference between reading words and understanding them, the crucial importance of those higher level thinking skills like inference and putting ideas together, the potential role that our mental workspace plays, and most importantly, the encouraging news that these essential comprehension skills can be improved with focused teaching.
And if we step back and look at the bigger picture, it really makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
How might these findings change the way we approach reading education? How can we better identify and support children who might be facing these specific comprehension challenges?
Hmm.
Are we perhaps focusing too much on just how quickly and fluently a child can read aloud?
Definitely food for thought.
Yeah.
We encourage you to delve deeper into the research we've discussed and other related topics. This deep dive is really just the starting point for a much broader understanding. Thanks for joining us.